Thank you, Cristiano, for the kind introduction as well. Thank you, Rada. Before I share my first screen, I would like to tell you that I am a teacher at the Amsterdam Fashion Academy, and I teach several lectures, among them visual presentation, fashion communications, and contextual studies. In contextual studies, we review different issues. One of those is gender, other one is culture and class in relation to fashion. So we look at the history of art and the history of culture, and we see how fashion expresses different aspects of gender, identity, class, and culture. Apart from that, I'm an advocate for LGBTI inclusion and diversity and inclusion in general. So for me, this talk touches upon topics that are very dear to me. So I'm very proud and I'm very honored of being invited to have this talk. Instead of introducing me longer, I'm going to share with you a list of information about me that you can read, and we're going to do an exercise about exclusion and inclusion. You can read some information about me and form yourself an opinion. That's what we do with people all the time when we just meet them. In a quick scan, probably I'm talking 1 minute about myself. You probably already have an opinion about me. You know if I could be your friend or not, if I'm dangerous or not, if you want to listen further to my presentation or not. I don't see anybody quitting from the presentation, so I assume you're interested. And let's go ahead, and I'm going to just stop talking for 5 to 10 seconds, and I'm going to let you read this information about me. I chose this photo specially because it combines the LinkedIn profile photo that I have with a photo on my first day at school. And the spirit that I always try to remind myself is that even though I'm a lecturer and I'm teaching students, I'm also a student. So I try to remind me that I'm always learning. So let's get onto our presentation. The contents today that we're going to discuss is what's the advancement of diversity and inclusion. The year 2018 was called the Year of Diversity. So we're going to review main things that happened during that year. We're going to see why and how diversity and inclusion is so relevant for any industry, and especially for the fashion industry. We're going to talk about exclusion. We're going to see the differences between diversity and inclusion. And we're going to see specific examples within the Fashion Academy and within the fashion industry. So the title of my presentation is Perspective on Diversity and Inclusion in the Fashion Industry. And when I was looking for an image for this presentation, this image of a Gucci fashion show came to my mind. I don't know if you've seen it, but I find this show very special. I'm going to skip the video that I had prepared. You can just Google Gucci Women's Wear 2020. But let me tell you a little bit about this show. What I find about this fashion show very interesting is that the catwalk is being turned into a sphere. It's spherical, it's round, and it's been turned into a carousel. What's very special about this is if you look past the models, you're going to see that the backstage and the stage don't have any separation. So the people that work in the fashion show are included as part of the show. Furthermore, if we go to the next slide, here you can see, if you see behind the models, the assistants, the hairdresser, the makeup artist are always on stage and are always to be seen. So they participate together with the models. The workers are models in some sort of sense. If we look at the image at the right, you're going to see that this is a sort of carousel, but on the top there's a metronome, which acts as a sort of clock. So it's ticking time. And now that I'm thinking about this show in the context of Corona, I came to the idea that the fashion industry is, and all industries are in some sort of like a pause. We're all paused in social isolation, and we have an incredible opportunity to stop for a while and think about what we're doing, think about what the fashion industry is doing, the impacts, and think about how we can change that once we retake our activities or we go back to our work. There's an incredible opportunity in stopping and watching. This fashion show is interesting because it was like a carousel. It is like a carousel. It turns over and over, and it symbolizes for me the fashion industry, how it never stops, how we have season after season, and there's non-stop consumption. So we have an opportunity to think about the system and to change the system. And I believe that diversity and inclusion is very relevant for the fashion industry in that sense. Here you have two images. The show started like an empty set, and the guests could come through the show, through the backstage. They could see what was happening, they could see the preparation, and once the models were ready in this carousel, instead of modeling, they just walked away. So actually the catwalk was the models getting out of this aquarium or out of this bubble, and what was left in the stage were the workers, the assistants, the makeup artists, the people that never gets to be shown in a show. So in a way, the models were some sort of accessory or puppets. You can see it there. Then in some point they walk away, and the only thing left is the stage, the empty stage on one side, and the workers themselves, the people that never get shown. So this for me was very symbolic, because it also represents inclusivity, showing the people that is invisible normally, and the people who do most of the job or an important part of the job. So I think that, as we're going to see later, there's a distinction between diversity and inclusion, and we're going to explore that relation. So as I mentioned a while ago, 2018 was named the year of diversity. And I asked myself, I put a question mark there. Was it really the year of diversity? Was it inclusive? And we're going to see some examples about that. Good examples, bad examples, neutral examples, and mostly ideas for you to get inspired. Especially, I know that there's lots of students watching this presentation. We cannot define and explore diversity and inclusion, especially inclusion strategies for companies, in depth today. But if some of these slides and some of these companies and some of these ideas inspire any student or researcher to explore further, then I think my presentation would have had sense. So let's see a little bit about data. We always like to start thinking about things with data. So in 2018, there's a study made by the fashionspot.com called Diversity Report. You can Google more if you want to read it. I totally recommend it. They made a study where they analyzed more than 200 advertisement campaigns in fashion and around 541 exactly models. So from these 500 and so models, we see a split. We see that only 10% are plus size models. Same 10% are models over the age of 50, and less than 1% of the models are transgenders. The 10 is actually 5%. 5% are plus size, 5% are over 50, and less than 1% are transgenders. So is it really diverse? No, we have some sort of more diversity in these advertisement campaigns, but the representation of these minorities is still underrepresented. If we look at the right, we see what happens with models of colors. And here it's a little bit more optimistic, the result. It's a little bit more positive. We see that between 2015 and 2018, there's 15% or 50% of race in the models of colors that are appearing in advertising. So it was 34% of these 500 plus models. So this talks about visibility and representation of minorities in the mainstream. It's very important to be represented because consumers and people participating from a culture need to feel themselves represented in order to feel valued and to feel that they belong. So I want to say also with this slide that yes, 2018 was a great year for diversity, but is the job done? I don't think so. So why does diversity and inclusion matter for a fashion organization, for a fashion company, for a brand, or for students, or for people in general? Why diversity and inclusion is important for the industry or different industries? Well, there's two reasons. It's good for profit, because fashion needs to sustain itself, but it's also good for people. This we call the business case for diversity and inclusion. So there was this study in 2015 done by McKinsey and Company, which is called Diversity Matters. And I believe that they did a second version in 2018, but the numbers are more or less the same. Well, what they came up with this study is that companies that are diverse in their ethnicity, that have different ethnic groups as part of the workforce, are 35% more likely to have financial success or in their financial performance. And then when they added the factor of gender, companies that are both ethnic diverse and have a diversity in gender are 25% more likely to be successful financially. So there is a business case for diversity and inclusion. And on the people side, we have to think that workers spend 1/3 of their life in an organization or in a company. Students also spend 1/3 of their day, when we could, in the school. Now we're meeting through webcam. But under regular conditions, we spend 1/3 of our lives either studying or working. And if we are not accepted in the place where we work, if we don't feel represented in the place where we work or study, and if we cannot be ourselves, we are 30% less productive. This is also a research result that was conducted. So not only we're 30% less productive, but we are also less happy and we feel less valuable to that community where we participate. So it's very important to consider diversity and inclusion because it's not only good for the business, it's also good for the people. But let's go a little bit back. Let's go exactly 300 years back in time when the fashion industry started. So this gentleman here in a very fancy outfit is Louis XIV. This person invented the fashion industry as we know it. Why? He was a king of France and he was called the Sun King. So he was the center of the universe. And in order to have everything, all the planets and all the people revolving around him, he had to reinvent himself via fashion, but he also invented the fashion industry in France, which is the same industry that is operating until today. It got expanded, it got bigger, it got global, but it's operating under the same, almost the same works or the same ways. So what did he do? Just in short, he invented seasons, that things would go out of fashion. He invented a dress code. So only the nobles that could talk to him had to move to Versailles, and in order to attend to the official meetings, they had to wear specific garments. He dictated the fashion of the time, that was of course changing all the time, and the nobles had to purchase dresses in order to access to him. And then he invented credit. So if you didn't have money to change your outfits, you could get in debt in order to get the new outfit in order to access the king. Another thing that he did, he invented fashion publications who were actually telling people which was the new fad, the new trend. And he also, you can see here pointed with a white arrow, he was wearing red shoes with a red heel. And that meant that he was the king, and anybody else around him who could wear these red heels was in favor of the queen. So it was the in crowd, the people that got privileges. So the point of this slide for me is that fashion, the fashion industry, was based on the exclusion of people. Some people were in, some people were out, some people were living in Paris, some people got to live in Versailles. And from those people, a very special group got to wear the high heels. So that was the luxury group, the in crowd. Those people got rights, got advantages, favors and immunities because they were the in crowd. Fashion and the luxury sector in general is always been based in exclusion. That's why being inclusive in fashion, it's so difficult and it's been so slow of a process. So fashion establishes, due to being exclusive, some normative behaviors in everybody. These are behaviors agreed by society and labeled as correct or desirable. And at the same time, that makes that humans, because we want to be accepted and we are social beings and we want companionship and we want to belong to some group, we start changing our behavior because we want to adapt and we want to be accepted by a group. We feel that we need to fit into a group. So there's this thing called normative social influence that makes us change our behavior to adapt to a group. How is it that in 300 years in the fashion industry, we've gone from sun kings to drag queens? Many of us are watching RuPaul's Drag Queen race, but after 300 years, the problems of inequality are very similar. Women are still fighting for equality. Women that work are fighting for recognition, for the same level of salaries and access to promotions. People of colors or ethnic minorities are still struggling to be recognized. And here somebody can argue with me and say, yeah, but things have changed a lot. But the base problems still exist. So I ask myself, why is it so slow? Why aren't we all diverse and inclusive all of a sudden? Or after 300 years, how come it hasn't changed more drastically? And the answer to this is, yes, we are much more open in terms of trends. We like to see diversity, but our brain is wired in such a way that establishes discrimination. So I just asked you a while ago to read 10 facts about myself, and probably you form yourself already an opinion of who I am, what I am. As I said before, am I friendly or not? Am I dangerous or not? So our brain works processing very quickly information, visual information, and judging whatever we have in front, including people and including their outfits. That's why fashion is so key to putting people in stereotypes or in boxes. So the next slide, I'm going to explain what it's needed in order to change our mentality, to open our mind. The type of functioning that I was describing before is binary thinking. Binary thinking, you can think of it as a switch or as a box. There's this metaphor of putting people in boxes. So when you read that I'm Chilean, that I'm Italian, that I'm 40 plus, or any other information, that I'm vegan, you immediately can put me in a box. Oh, he's vegan. Oh, he's Latino. And those things are very sharp distinctions. We used to put people in boxes. And that type of thinking, it's binary thinking. You're either black or white. You're either in or out. You're rich or poor. So we think about black and white, about very high contrast or opposites. You cannot be one, you are the other. What's needed in order to be more inclusive and to generate more diversity, the visibilization of diversity, is we need to change the way we think. We shouldn't think in a judgmental way that it's good or bad, because good and bad are part of the same spectrum. So if we look at the right side, we don't have switches or boxes. We have these things that are kind of like sliders or volumes. So this is a radical change. If we think of spectrums instead of boxes, the whole reality opens up and things are not just good or bad or black and white, but they're different levels of the same thing. So in both extremes, we have rich and we have poor, we have old and we have young. Age is a very good example of this. Nobody is extremely old or extremely young. We're all both. And in different times, in different moments of our life, these slides to one side of the other. We saw before in the presentations about gender that gender is also fluid. So you're not fully percent man, fully percent woman. There's people who are non-conforming and they place themselves in the middle. So the slider mentality is much more useful and desired if we want to open up and to include difference. So let's do a little definition. What is diversity? Because we talk about it a lot, diversity, and some people use diversity and inclusion as if they were the same thing, and they're not. Diversity, in a simple way, is understanding that everybody is unique and that everybody is different, and also recognizing those differences as strengths. Somebody, I think Gavi was talking about cultural appropriation, and there was a moment that it was mentioned, like, people don't realize that they are appropriating. If they would inform themselves a little bit more, they wouldn't appropriate other culture or shamanic dresses or things that are ritual for other cultures. Well, if you have a diverse team in your company, if your team of creative people is diverse, it's more likely that somebody's going to say, wait a minute, that is an Alaskan shaman symbology. We shouldn't be dealing with that. Or a person of color would say, hey, we're using these dreadlocks. Don't we have to credit the style of these people? So if you have a diverse team, you have a strong team because you have multiple perspectives and you value their input. Diversity is recognizing differences. And how many of these differences are? In the right, you see a list, and this is not all, but it's a quite good separation of different aspects of diversities. So the first four are visual or are actually evident when you see somebody. So ethnicity, gender, body type, and age. We can kind of like guess that or have a hunch on it. But there's some types of diversity that are invisible. And these invisible aspects are sexual orientation, class, physical abilities, cognitive abilities, religious beliefs, political views, or some lifestyle choices. Like I used a second ago, being vegan. It's also a lifestyle choice. People are different and people are unique. And then what's the difference between diversity and inclusivity or inclusion? Well, the difference is when you respect and appreciate and value the members of these communities. So everybody, regardless of these differences, are considered as valuable, are listened, and are integrated in the decision processes. That last part is very important for organizations in general, but for the fashion industry. You don't only copy the dreadlock from the minority group or copy the jacket from the shaman. You have people in your team that are diverse, and you value them and you consult them before you make decisions. Even better, you not only consult people of a team for decisions, you have diversity in different levels of the organizations, all the way to the top, the people that report directly to the CEOs or the president. That whole level in the organization has to be diverse. And then you will be strong and you will generate a climate of inclusion. Inclusion is a climate, and diversity, some people even say it's a result of providing a climate of inclusion where everybody can be themselves. They don't have to hide their ethnic origins. They don't have to hide their sexual orientation. So everybody thrives and becomes diverse. The teams becomes diverse because the organization is generating a climate of inclusion. Let's go a little bit deeper in these differences. So what time is it? We're going to go into fashion examples, but there's one more aspect to this. All these levels of diversity, levels of being different, they're not separate. They mix onto each other. So sometimes these different aspects of diversity can even generate more discrimination instead of inclusion. How does this play? So there's this thing called intersectionality, and it's different aspects of social discrimination that can overlap onto each other and generate more discrimination. So let's take an example. There's a woman that becomes a migrant, goes to another country, and is also part of like an ethnic minority. Being an ethnic minority, being a woman, and being a migrant invisibilizes this person more and more and more. Let's think then you add the age factor or the class factor. So sometimes discrimination can overlap into each other and generate more levels of invisibility. That's why I was talking at the beginning of the presentation on how important visibility and representation of minorities is in the fashion industry. If you see yourself reflected, you can envision yourself as participating from that group or that community. So to put it in a metaphor that it's relative to or pertaining to fashion, if diversity is the thread, inclusion is the needle. What does that mean? It means that in order to reap the benefits of diversity, we need leaders and diverse leaders to pull this needle, the needle of the inclusion, through the fashion system. And that is inside and outside of the organization. So we need diverse leaders in all levels of the organization, and we need them to help create this climate of inclusion, but also recognize outside of the organization, in the customer base, in the supply chain, also generate and become an advocate for inclusivity and diversity. Another metaphor is diversity is inviting everybody to the party, but inclusion is letting everybody dance. It's about generating a climate. If you want to learn more about the business case for diversity and inclusion, because I have to cut this part short in order to go to the examples on fashion, you can read Insider Outsider, which is a report on inclusion and diversity in the fashion industry. It was commissioned by PVH. It has a focus on the United States, but the information is quite interesting. So I recommend that you Google it and you can download it. And it has briefings for the fashion industry. It's quite relevant and very interesting. So let's see a little bit of examples of what's happening in the fashion industry. Before that, I want to show you some examples of diversity and inclusion that I see inside of the Fashion Academy in Amsterdam. So we have Virginie, and in our fashion communications class, we write a blog. And she chose the topic of fashionable grannies. So women that are 60 plus and are still stylish and fashionable and have an opinion. I really like this topic because she's giving visibility to 60 plus women in fashion. Noemi van het Lam, for a case study, also in fashion communications, chose the topic of self-acceptance and self-worth in the fashion industry. And she focused on the work of Peter De Vito, which is a young photographer of 20 years old who started photographing himself and models without makeup and without Photoshop. So he normalized having imperfect skin. It's the normalization of acne. And he's studying or raising the issue on how this affects people, teenagers or young people. We have the whole situation on Facetune and trying to be perfect and trying to remove imperfections. And he's actually doing the opposite. He's visibilizing, normalizing having an imperfect skin. Valerie Bogart also, she's not in my class for the diversity brief, but she's my student as well in contextual studies. And in a brief on diversity with the teacher Laura Malone, she developed a concept for a collection. And this collection is inspired by the 1974 war in Cyprus. And she mixed two cultures and two traditions that are divided but coexist in the island. And she ideated a concept of, by division and by putting together, realizing a collection. So I was very moved by her text as well, because she said, stepping outside of my comfort zone, I realized that there's always two sides of a story. And it's true, there's always two sides of a story, and you need to be inclusive and open your mind and stop thinking of these binaries, us and them, and open yourself to sliders and volumes. And finally, we have a group activity. During one of the contextual studies brainstorms, we raised the topics of political fashion, and a group composed by Tracy, Gabriela, and Sofia came up with a concept for a fashion show that raised awareness on the issue of the ban of transgender people in the US military. So for this, they came with the idea of creating a fashion show where 100% of the team and the models would be transgender, and also the garments would be designed to accommodate the needs, the bodies, and the performance needed to suit the needs of transgender people. I always get very pleased and excited when I see assignments or collections or even the presentations that we see early, when students pick up on issues on gender and identity and inclusion, and then I see it as a creative output. It's always very rewarding for teachers. So let's have a look at the fashion industry. I'm going to have a quick view of different visibilities from diversity. So Kelly Brown is a fashion influencer and a blogger. She invented this hashtag called Fat at Fashion Week. She was tired of going to fashion weeks and not see plus size people being featured or showcased or even sold products. So he created this hashtag to call out the industry for not listening to plus size people, for not serving their needs, and to raise awareness. So if you go to Instagram and you put the hashtag Fat at Fashion Week, you're going to see it has almost 3,000 posts, and it started popping up in fashion weeks in all over the world. So this is a way of raising awareness on plus size or on diverse bodies. I have an example of a company which is called Universal Standard, and they claim themselves to be the world's most inclusive brand. That is to be still decided and researched further. But what is interesting about this company is that they don't use one or two models and then size mathematically. They take at least 11 fit models to develop all the sizing of their collection, because people don't grow tall and wide at the same time or in the same proportion. So they use real people and a much more diverse model base in order to fit everybody, every size. We talked about in other presentations Victoria's Secret. They managed to always get themselves into trouble. And we've seen, probably you heard about this, but in 2018, the executive made two types of remarks. They made remarks that were shaming big size people and also trans people. And this we call fat phobia and transphobia. So basically they made these remarks, and we saw that same year their fashion show had the lowest views ever. The company was not doing good for a while, but just before a fashion show, if an executive from a company make these remarks, that means that you're going to lose big audiences. And if in the same remark you do fatphobic remarks and transphobic remarks, you're going to lose a lot of followers and a lot of attention. And actually that happens. So who rose in the fall in the quasi-monopoly from Victoria's Secret? Well, Rihanna. We had the same year Rihanna presented her Savage Fenty collection. The event was inclusive. It was not a traditional catwalk. She presented all body sizes, all colors, and all identities. So she really gave visibility to the people that were invisible in these Victoria's Secret shows. And this is people who use interior clothing, they buy lingerie, and they need to see themselves reflected. She included also two pregnant models, but also famous models like Bella Hadid. So you see that there's all models and all people in one show. Other two brands that I recommend you to check is Laura's Under There. You see that the names are already special. And Slick Chicks. Laura's Under There is customized underwear. You can choose your prints, and for every piece that you buy, they would give one to somebody in need. And Slick Chicks, they are intersectional, what I was talking, mixing these levels of diversity. So they produce garments, undergarments, that are thought easy to put on or off if you're standing, if you're laying down. So for people that have different abilities, they can put them on and off quicker. This is considering different bodies, different abilities, and putting that thinking intersectionally when you develop a collection. This probably you already heard. Tommy Hilfiger, I think in 2016 or earlier, made a collection called Adaptative. Their garments have hooks, they have magnetic buttons or braces that adapt to people with prostheses. So they really changed the way of confectioning the garments in order to fit people with different abilities. I don't like to call it disabilities. I just prefer to say different abilities, because we all have different abilities. There's the cognitive abilities and there's also the physical abilities. This is an all-time favorite of mine of don'ts. Don't do this. I don't have a lot of recommendations in my presentations. This is just perspectives about diversity and inclusion. But one thing that is always wrong is racist remarks. Even if they're funny, or even if you claim that you were unaware of it. But if you use or refer to blackface, you're gonna get backlash. And that comes from social media and from the black community right away. So we have Prada and we have Gucci alluding to blackface. They claim that they were not aware. Again, if you have a diverse team and an inclusive culture in your organization, somebody will say, hey, people, should we think about this before we launch it? But that didn't happen in companies like Gucci and Prada. So we have that immediately they faced social boycott. They had to offer public apologies and also withdraw these products from the market right away. And sometimes these risks are calculated. They know they're going to get a scandal, but hey, any promotion is good promotion, right? We're going to see a case where that didn't happen. And probably you also know about that. It's 7-4. The cost of racism. So Dolce & Gabbana made racist remarks just before their launch in China of a fashion show. And the way they handled the scandal was every time worse. So they were racist, they were sexist, they didn't respond on time, they didn't offer apologies on time. And at the end of this scandal, they lost practically the market in China. They had to cancel the show, models pulled out, and their influencers pulled out. So they're still facing a sustained crisis because of not alluding or not listening to the traditions of the new market. On top of that, the agency that they have locally in China claimed that they informed them. They told them that this campaign would be sensitive and would not be taken good. And they continued. They continued with this. So that tells me that they knew they were going to create a scandal, but they thought, hey, every publicity is good publicity, and that flipped on them. And they're still dealing with the aftermath of that. Finally, I have two examples. One is Valentino on the good side, similar to the Gucci example of the beginning. We have Valentino at the end of the show. Pierpaolo Piccioli, when he came out to greet the public, he didn't come alone to get the applause. He brought the petit men, these people who work with him in the atelier, and he pulled the whole team outside to receive the applause. This is also giving visibility to the women that work behind the man, to the employees that work behind the creative director. So this is giving a moment of recognition to everybody, not just one person. And the last one is about visibility as well, and it's a positive example. We have in 2018 as well, Virgil Abloh is the first black creative of Louis Vuitton. He's not the first black creative director. He's the third one that takes over a French fashion heritage brand. And this is a big deal because what we were talking, visibility and the representation of minorities in position of power. So it's not just showing the people who work in the atelier or showing diversity in the catwalk. It's actually giving a position to a person of color because of his merits and his creativity. Is it the best designer according to me? No. Is it the most original one? Also not. But I consider that this is a very important moment. Louis Vuitton is making money with this. Yes, it's a commercial move, but at the same time, it's very good in terms of diversity and inclusion. So, to finish and wrap up, what's next? I think we tackled or we ticked the list in diversity on the catwalk. We need to do better. Just having 1% of transgender and 5% or less of people of color or big plus-sized women or etc. Having more diverse in the catwalk is not enough. It's not the only thing. The next thing is moving from the catwalk to the boardroom. What I mentioned before, having a diverse organization, having representing minority groups in all levels of the organization, including the CEOs, and letting people of minority groups also be part of the decision making. This is the way that you create an inclusive culture, and the result of that inclusive culture will be everybody thriving in diversity. There's some saying there that I heard some time ago that is, take care of your people first, and they will take care of the customers. So you don't promote that you're diverse and inclusive. You don't put your logo on the Paris Pride Week as a first action. First, you need to be inclusive within your company, and then you can brag about it or make marketing about it. So what I consider that is needed for changing the industry is sustained improvements in the catwalk and then systemic changes inside of the organization. That's my presentation for today. I'd like to open the discussion for everybody to make questions about all the presentations and give back the control to Cristiano or Rada.